Hello, everybody. I'm just popping on here to give a very brief kind of overview of chapter 16. This may help some of you who may have not gotten everything during the lecture. Of course, this is not going to replace the fact that you need to read the chapter, and this is in no way going to be a full lecture, of course. It's really designed to be probably about 15 minutes. I'm going to try this out and see if it works, how you guys respond to it. So let me know if you find this helpful at all. All right, so chapter 7, we are talking about capital and labor. So we're going to start off with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Now, it was particularly significant because it sort of set the standard and the mark for the need for unions, and there needed to be some reform going on. It was actually spurred on by things like wage cuts. We had strikes, we had a disruption of the railroad system, and the capitalists did not like that. We had business leaders and government officials actually calling for violence against the strikers. So, this is not the first time that we see the government and big business joining together to go against the citizenry with violence, okay? So in this case, we had 100 strikers who actually ended up dead and over 1,000 who ended up in jail as a result of the strike. So, of course, you start your labor unions, the very first one being the Knights of Labor. Now, one of the things that made them particularly significant, not only because they were the first, but they accepted blacks, they accepted women, they accepted Hispanics, Native Americans, you name it, you could come in and join. They also were trying to fight for the cause or champion the causes of both farmers and manufacturers. Okay. Now, how they ended up kind of coming to their end was by what some may call a false flag incident. So let's tell you about in Chicago in 1886, May 1st. That part's not as important. But in 1886, there was the Haymarket Square riot. Now, here you had the police officers fire on the protesters who were literally protesting for a better work day, an 8-hour work day. They were also asking for better working conditions and fair wages. So in order to stop it, they sent police in to fire on them, and people ended up dead, okay, and many more were hurt. Well, the next day in Haymarket Square, a bomb was set off, and that bomb actually claimed the lives of 7 police officers. Well, now the spin comes in and says, oh, look at these Knights of Labor. These unions are violent. They're anarchists. They must be avoided at all costs. So, of course, it disbanded because all of the membership kind of left because nobody wants to be considered to be an anarchist or be associated with something that is so violent. So that was a way to really try and stop unions, one of the tactics used to keep unions from forming. Okay. Well, right after that, you had another union start up, the AFL, which is the American Federation of Labor. Now, they touted themselves as being more conservative in their approach, even though they said, hey, we still are very much interested in fair wages, an 8-hour workday, and better, safer work conditions, right? Now, a couple of things, though, that really sets them apart from the aforementioned Knights of Labor. One, they were focused mostly on trades. So like you had, on the East Coast, you had the steel workers in Pittsburgh, right? So the steel workers unions, you had, now we have the teachers unions, we have nurses unions, etc. So these things are based strictly on your trade or occupation, right? So you're only eligible to join it if you're in that trade. That's one thing. Secondly, they were by and large exclusive and did not really allow women, blacks, and any other minorities. So that was another major issue with this particular union that was formed. Also, where you say there's strength in numbers. Well, this was again a very divisive technique because you are splitting up groups that used to be more cohesive, regardless of whether they were farmers or manufacturers or what trade you were in. You still had this common goal and they worked together towards that. Well, you kind of start compartmentalizing people. So that was another issue. So next we talk about monopolies, how they get started, how they really got started. Between 1895 and 1904, so in that 9-year period, you had over 4,000 companies merged together to form these corporations, right? And to actually start monopolies. 3 of the major ones that we know are steel, the railroad, and oil in particular. Okay, now of course there are some others, but interestingly enough, each one of those guys, the 3 of them, commanded more wealth than whole countries put together. So if you looked at the gross product of France, Great Britain, and Germany put together, couldn't touch them. So that puts in perspective just how much wealth these guys wielded, how much power and influence financially, okay? Next thing we talk about is social Darwinism. So Darwinism by Charles Darwin, okay, is where it gets its name from. It's a theory of evolution that was started and written about in his book On the Origin of Species. And while it did gain some traction in its form, basically talking about natural selection, saying, well, with animals, animals that are better adapted to their environment can then have a better chance of procreating and keeping their lineage on. They won't die out. Whereas animals who are not as well adapted, or the ones of that species that are not as well adapted, will then die out, become extinct. And only the stronger of that species will continue to procreate and thrive. Well, you had a socialist, Herbert Spencer, who decided to take that theory and apply it to people. Okay, so under him, social Darwinism really gets started, whereby they're saying, hey, survival of the fittest. If you are poor, if you are on the bottom, it's because you're not as smart. It's because you're not, you don't run fast enough. You don't jump high enough. You're just not as good. So, you're going to die out because you just can't cut the mustard. It's your fault. Forget the fact that laws are passed that are in favor of the capitalist and so forth. We got into that a little bit more and, review your notes. But, overall, this is where the social Darwinism comes in. It also is the great excuse that is being used to justify the abuse and mistreatment of the lower classes, the poor, the working class. It's like, who cares if they die on our equipment? Who cares? So this is an idea that's really being pushed and gaining a lot of traction. Okay. Also, you have H.L. Mencken, who actually writes the following, and I'll actually read it. The strong must grow stronger, and that they may do so, they must waste no strength in the vain task, of trying to uplift the weak. So let's not even worry about people who are sick, people who are poor, people who are widowed, fatherless, all of these things that, interestingly enough, a country that's founded on Christian principles, that is what you're supposed to do, is to help and support the less fortunate, the sick, the weak, the feeble. But this is an idea that's the exact opposite of that, all right? So then you have the populist movement come through, and it was actually grassroots completely. It was started by farmers, and Now, keeping in mind at this time, most of America was farmers. I mean, mostly everybody was a farmer. Of course, you lived in the major cities where there was manufacturing, not so much farming, but the rest of the vast majority of the country, people were farmers, and they were having some real challenges. So some of the things that they were having problems with is some of you guessed it, the agricultural conglomerates were driving them out of business. So what was happening is you've got, just like you had your venture capitalists in manufacturing and business, you also had them involved in agriculture. They would buy hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres. Kind of sound like Bill Gates doing over there in Arkansas, but I digress. They buy up all this land, and they have the machinery, they have all of the technology to do things faster and at a larger scale than the small mom and pop farms, that may be a few hundred acres, or maybe even as much as 1,000 acres. Well, they can't compete because they still are doing things, say the older way or the traditional way with, without machines. So they're going in debt and they're losing their farms because they can't keep up. Also, they have no say in the price, how the pricing is for the crops. So with these large industrial farming complexes, they can do it so much faster with less labor and everything, because they've got the reapers and they've got the plows and they've got all these things. Doing it with mechanized, they can sell things much cheaper. So they're setting the prices a lot lower than what a traditional farmer can afford to sell at. So that was some of the issues. So from them, from some of what they were trying to do, which one was to set up kind of a co-op, to help themselves. They said, what? Like, I'm here in Texas, right? So, East Texas, they might say, okay, well, a group of us are going to get together. We're going to buy our reapers and, plows and whatever, machinery, and we're going to share it. Okay. We're also going to bargain for better prices. We're also going to, just do things as a group to help ourselves, to help regulate the market, etc. Now, their work in their, co-op actually resulted in a party, a political party called the Populist Party. And they really began to get a lot of traction. Why? Because they advocated for the everyman. Once again, farmers, manufacturers, the laborers. So they became kind of like a labor party to some degree. They also, so in addition to, fair wages and, those kind of things, they also advocated for more governmental control in certain areas. So things like the railroad, the telegraph system, it's like these things need to be, state run and, make it more equitable and fair. Okay. Now they did come very, very close to winning the presidential election with, William Jennings Bryan. Okay, very charismatic speaker. Now, a couple of things about the Populist Party, because even though they were a party of their own, they actually ran under the Democrat ticket. So, so again, kind of keeping that Republican Democrat thing that started very early on, kind of moving through in those ranks. So they didn't just flat out go and run as a populist. However, much of the Democratic Party were populist. Okay. Now, they ultimately did lose to the Republican candidate, McKinley, right? And some of the reasons why they lost is because the Republicans, McKinley, he had money and lots of it. So any broadsides, newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, just the dissemination of information, that cost. The media systems, even though it was all in print at the time, if you don't have the money to pay for the paper, if you will, you're not going to get your message out as clearly or in as many places as the folks with the money. So that was one of the major reasons they didn't win. Also, another big reason is because many of the Democrats in the South, particularly, they absolutely refused to support a party, even though they were being crushed under the oppressive weight of this capital system. They were being individually, destroyed. But rather than join with other minorities, blacks, Hispanics, etc., to, for something that could have potentially helped them, they would rather cut off the nose to spite the racist face, if you will. So, interesting points there. Okay, so let's see here. Moving into the Socialist Party. Now, as the Populist Party it didn't really fizzle out, it just sort of transitioned. Many of the people, because they couldn't secure the presidency, all right, many of the people who were populist started to move into socialism. Now, socialism, or the father of socialism in America, is a man named Karl Marx. He and Frederick Engels wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto, right? And they had several principles and ideas I think a lot of people, particularly the everyman, was in favor of. So they had a doctrine that embraced everybody. First of all, it didn't matter race, class, gender, ethnicity. They didn't discriminate in that regard. They also understood that there was a class war in full swing between the bourgeois and the proletariat. So the bourgeois is the upper class, the rich, the elite. And then everybody else are the people who work to make them richer. And that's basically how it goes. And those are the proletariat. All right. So they wanted to basically overthrow capitalism and implement a more cooperative, communitive commonwealth is what they were actually advocating. And, their downfall was kind of layered. So they really did pick a lot of traction up. But a few things happened. One is, like I mentioned earlier, some of the things that they wanted to, they were saying they wanted to have done, some of those some of that progress had actually started being made. So, if you keep screaming for it, oh, 8-hour workday, 8-hour workday, but people are, that's already kind of in the works to start moving towards those things, it kind of takes the, again, it takes the sting out of it. It takes a lot of the power out of it. But they were also kind of had a downfall because of governmental oppression. We're talking communism here. Oh, no. So here are some very socialist, communist ideas, which is the actual antithesis of what America stands for. Very much capitalism. Okay, so on the polar opposite of that is socialism. So they were really being oppressed by the government. They were oftentimes jailed, rounded up. They were censored, a lot of censorship. And as we went into World War I, by 1914, it was a wrap. If you were even suspected of being a socialist, a communist, it was going to be bad for you, So freedom of speech, even though we say, oh yeah, First Amendment, Second Amendment, all these different amendment rights, they mean nothing if what you want to say goes against status quo. So that was another major point of their downfall. So that is it. That is the majority of what is going on in, at least some highlights of what goes on in chapter 16. So let me know, you guys, if you find this helpful. I may consider continuing on with this, kind of doing this by chapter, maybe 15 minutes or so. And 15, 20 minutes, I guess, something like that. So let me know if you guys like this, if it works for you or not. All right. Well, have a great weekend. Bye now.